Okay, welcome to the next of our replication conversations. Today, I'm talking with Rob Klassen from the Ivy School of Business at Western Ontario University. This conversation is going to be a little bit different from some of the others because when I asked Rob if he would participate in the series, he graciously said yes, and then he suggested that the paper he'd like to talk about, really the project he'd like to talk about, is one that we did together. And what I thought was really interesting about that suggestion was that I had been thinking about that project as well in terms of how it related to future work. Because if you look at the project Rob's going to talk about, it comes to the conclusion that organizations can be safe and productive if they do certain things. And the subsequent work that we did suggests that that may be true, but in general, that's not what the average company is doing. In other words, that the papers kind of contradict each other, but they're also wildly different in terms of sample methodology and so on. And so determining what's going on becomes really complicated. And so in essence, we're going to talk about how do we move in a systematic fashion, if you will, to better link those two projects. Because typically what we would do is we would design a third project with bits and pieces of each, and we'd probably come up with a third conclusion and wouldn't be able to tell you why it differed from the first two papers. So at this point, I'll shut up because you're here to talk and listen to Rob. So Rob, you want to talk about our project in Canada?
Sure. Well, first of all, Mark, thanks for inviting me. I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about, I think, one of the challenges we as a field face looking at replication. And my understanding is this is not the first conversation, so I hope not to replicate simply the prior ones. But as we sort of think about what happens in many research projects, is you sort of start with an idea. We certainly did that in terms of the safety management project we did. And then it grows in multiple directions as you start to think about sub-research questions and how you might best attack those particular sub-questions. And so for those of you who aren't familiar or haven't seen the paper, we had a project that actually generated several different papers because it used multiple methods. But it was really looking at the broad question, can you be safe and productive at the same time? And ultimately have good performance on both dimensions. And so we undertook a large case-based project, part of the study, that looked at 10 different companies. The article appeared now, it seems like a long time ago, it was 2014, but it really tried to assess in a Canadian context, because that's where we had access to companies and many of the researchers are based, how companies were struggling with the idea of managing safety and efficiency, productivity, quality, and so on at the same time. And the ultimate conclusion that came out of that was, first of all, you have to think about a joint management system around multiple dimensions. I won't go into those, but multiple dimensions. And then companies sort of separate themselves into two groups. Those that do think about an integrated system where they try to bring safety and ops together, and then another group of companies that seem to struggle with that idea and either emphasize one or the other, and sometimes neither very well. And so at the end of the project, at least the 10 cases that we saw a strong evidence or strong case-based evidence. And we're also able to unpack partly the how and the why that underpinned that. And so we saw that as contribution. Subsequent project, or sorry, part of that project, it was a different set of methods. It was a much larger sample space, really tried to verify that across a population of manufacturing firms in Ontario. Of course, we didn't get everyone to respond, but certainly a significant subpopulation did, or sorry, subsample did. And so similar results emerged from that, but now we're able to develop scales and so on that were usable in that space. Now, Mark, on the other end, has carried on with this work. I had a few administrative issues to deal with along the way as associate dean, so I wasn't quite as active, but Mark has certainly continued on looking at how this works more broadly in the space. And probably I should turn it to you, Mark, just to maybe illustrate that, where the conflict, or at least some of the challenges we see emerging, have happened.
Yeah, so the follow-up study we're both referring to was just recently published in Management Science, and we went about it very differently. So if the Canadian study had a lot of depth and a lot of detail about the firms, The follow-up study was about breadth. And so it ended up having, I think the sample was something like 120,000 organizations in the state of Oregon over 25 years. And the population we started with was every single organization in the state over those 25 years. And so but we had very limited data on them. We had data on whether they're growing or shrinking based on employment and whether they stayed in business or not. And those were the only measures of outcomes, if you will, that we had. And then we had data on their safety record. And the short version of what that paper showed was that organizations that had more accidents were more likely to survive. And that effect was larger for companies that were bigger, older, and growing. In other words, the organizations that are already more likely to survive benefited more from having accidents than the more precarious, young, small organizations, for instance. In other words, if in the Canadian data, I'd say it wasn't quite half, but it was close to half the firms were being safe and productive. It was a large group. In the Oregon data set, what we saw instead was the typical firm, and in general, was not being safe and productive. They're either surviving or they're being safe, but it wasn't both. And so clearly there's a disconnect here. And so now we're going to talk a little bit about how we might square that circle.
Yeah, and so I think one of the challenges is, if one thinks about replication, is whether you're exploring the exact same research question or different facets of a research question. And so here we clearly have multiple studies that ultimately are broadly stated exploring the same research question. But when you sort of unpack that, go one layer deeper, there definitely are some differences in terms of some of the subtext. And so when one thinks about replication, from my perspective, it really is, do you want to start to unpack the mechanisms that were done in the original article that I talked about, or are you trying to look more at the broad scale effect? And in essence, trying to, first of all, unpack mechanisms versus outcomes, and what are the benefits of looking at either? And from my perspective, looking at the mechanisms is incredibly important. It's also important to make the business case, so don't get me wrong, but trying to sort of think about what's the primary objective behind the replication. And if it's around the mechanisms, which was the first set of studies, can we start to unpack those mechanisms, possibly in a slightly different context? I wouldn't suggest anyone come back to Ontario to do the study. I think there'd be relatively little gain by doing that. But on the other hand, maybe in a service context, or maybe in an emerging economy context, maybe even in a European context where the approach to institutions and regulations is quite different, would allow us to further detail, further elaborate on some of those mechanisms for the subset of companies that are able to execute a joint management system well, versus companies that might be feeding the average effect that Mark has found in subsequent work in another context, which happened to be Oregon. So I think replication can really start to shed light on some of these important mechanistic questions. And at the same time, also say, is it just the context that matters? Or there may be background factors that neither one of us were able to understand that are driving some of the results that we have.
All right, cool. And so, I mean, that the two studies, because of their differences in depth versus breadth, you're in essence looking for more breadth, right? How do I expand in different, right? I'm pretty comfortable with the measurement approach and so on, but the sample is limited, the context is limited. And I would argue that the management science paper has the opposite problem.
Yeah.
And to get more breadth in anything other than a dream world is going to actually require a smaller sample, which is almost never what you think about when you're doing replication. But to understand why the average company across pretty much all industries was better off having accidents would probably require a smaller sample where we were able to capture some of the mechanisms that Rob captured. So one way to think about that is that we might go back and look at equally, longitudinal data over companies who have to report. So it could be publicly held companies in the US, or if you have access to UK data, you can actually get that for all companies through something
Mm,
called the FAME database. So you could still have that longitudinal component, and we could still have the testing of did they survive, but we could add additional outcome measures about profitability and other versions of flourishing, if you will. And simultaneously, we could also capture some, at least, of what they did internally. Are their operations well run, by looking at things like their inventory turnover and other stuff that we've done with secondary data. Now, clearly these two approaches still wouldn't get us to exactly the same place, but we'd start moving closer together so we could understand if the mechanism identified in Canada is context specific, or if the outcomes identified in Oregon really generalize, right? And put that whole thing together.
and ideally, I would see replication in this context, trying to capture some of the institutional background variables that are in place. I mean, you'll notice that both of the studies we reference were in a single regulatory context, Oregon or Ontario. And I can't help but question whether that's part of the challenge here. And so I would encourage any replication study to actually explicitly capture that type of thing. And so it wouldn't be a single country study or a single province. There would be notable differences that could be compared in the institutional context as well. And I think that's a challenge, because we want to, when we do the first study, we want to control as much as we can. We want to kind of limit the external factors to sort of look at the internal corporate or company mechanisms. We're ops researchers. But I think as we start to move to the next stage, which is replication plus, I'll call it, because there's a little bit we're adding on to that, we're now sensitive, given these different results, that there might be other factors that need to be studied in maybe a two context sort of study. And in that sense, I think we could certainly fill out both the gap between the later work that Mark described and the earlier work that we also undertook too.
Yeah, and to close with that, one of the things that, and we were talking about this before we quote unquote came on the air, is that choice of context then becomes really important. That you want to choose context that you would expect. In this case, we're talking about where regulation is likely to matter. You'd like to choose context where you'd expect the regulation to be somehow different. And oddly, if I was to pick a US state to compare to Ontario, I think Oregon and Ontario would probably be pretty good comparisons.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe we would need some place that was less well developed or had a different form of decentralized safety regulation or something like that.
Yeah. And I think some of the newer methods that we see and data sets that are emerging really allow for replication to, first of all, keep the same framing, same research question, and go that little bit extra deeper. So replication, to me, implies that there's a little bit more going on than maybe in the original study. Maybe not a different theory base, maybe not a different mechanistic explanation that's being generated, but some nuance in terms of how that's assessed. And so the databases that we now have certainly allow for more nuanced consideration, whether they're large financial based ones, Bloomberg and others like that, or whether they're region-specific databases that are now emerging because we just have more access. Also, I think offer new opportunities to really sort of explore some options. But even some of the methods that we now see emerging in the OM and JSCM type journals is around natural experiments, and so new regulations being introduced for safety in particular allows for some replication work that wouldn't otherwise have been able to be done 10 or 15 years ago. And the same with new trade agreements potentially influencing, for example, health and safety measures. Lots of concerns, for example, within the, I forget the full acronym, but the new NAFTA agreement in North America had clear implications in terms of safety practices across all three countries. And so there may be an opportunity there. It's more speculative on my part, but there might be opportunities there as well.
Yeah, and you'd be seeing the same thing in Europe with Brexit, where with the UK leaving the EU, at some point they're going to start making their own regulations, and that should again provide similar types of opportunities to see how
Exactly.
they started the same and then they diverged, and that had divergent effects. All right, well, it was really cool talking with you, and I appreciate that you took the time. And
Oh, great.
thank you for supporting the journal. Talk to you again soon.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it.